The TSA checkpoint hummed with the sterile anxiety of travel. For 17-year-old Leo Bishop, it was just a barrier between him and the national competition he was favored to win. But for Officer Frank Coleman, it was a stage. When Leo handed over his passport, Coleman didn't just scan it. He held it up, laughed, and in a voice loud enough for the whole line to hear, asked, "You sure this is you, kid?" The humiliation was instant. But what Coleman didn't know is that his petty display of power was the last mistake he'd ever make on the job. Because the teen he chose to ridicule wasn't just any passenger. The air in Concourse B of Charlotte Douglas International Airport had a metallic taste, a mixture of industrial cleaning solution, stale Cinnabon, and the faint ozone tang of the security scanners. It was the smell of tension, of people trying to get from one place to another with minimal friction. Leo Bishop, at 17, understood friction better than most. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, which contained a high-spec laptop worth more than the car his dad drove. Leo was not a large person. He was lean, with intelligent, restless eyes that scanned the security line not with the nervousness of a first-time flyer, but with the analytical gaze of a systems expert. He was, in fact, a systems expert. The CyberGuard National Finals in Washington, D.C. wasn't a science fair. It was a high-stakes, invitation-only event sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security itself. Leo was the youngest finalist by 3 years. He shifted his weight, his socks, a mismatched pair, one with binary code, the other with cartoon atoms, feeling thin inside his sneakers. He watched the TSA officers. They were a mix of bored, efficient, and overtly weary. Then there was the one at lane 3. This officer was different. His name tag read Coleman. He was a man in his mid-40s, with a paunch that strained the buttons of his blue uniform shirt and a face that seemed permanently fixed in a mask of irritable superiority. He wasn't just processing passengers, he was judging them. He'd make a loud comment about a woman's perfume, force a man to unlace his boots at a snail's pace, and roll his eyes at a family fumbling with their liquids. He was, Leo diagnosed, a man who had very little power in his life and who intended to use every ounce of the little he had at this checkpoint. Leo's turn came. He mentally sighed, hoping for a different lane, but the agent funneling the line pointed him directly to Coleman. "Next." Leo walked up. "Good morning," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Officer Coleman didn't look at him. He was busy staring at the screen of his colleague in the next lane. "ID and boarding pass," he grunted. Leo handed them over. He wasn't old enough to have a full driver's license, just a learner's permit, so he traveled with his passport. It was crisp, blue, and barely a year old, acquired for a potential trip to a tech summit in Toronto that had ultimately been cancelled. Coleman took the documents. He scanned the boarding pass for Washington Reagan. Then he opened the passport. He stopped. He looked down at the passport photo, a perfectly standard, deer-in-the-headlights image of 17-year-old Leonard Bishop. Then he looked up at the real Leo. He huffed a small, sharp laugh. "This you?" Coleman asked. "Yes, sir," Leo said. Coleman tapped the laminated page with a thick finger. "You look scared to death in this picture, kid. What, you think the camera was going to steal your soul?" Leo felt a hot flush crawl up his neck. The line behind him was silent. "It's just a passport photo, sir." Coleman's eyes narrowed. The brief moment of fun was over. Now it was time for suspicion. "Leonard Bishop," he said, dragging the name out. "Sounds important. You flying all by yourself, Leonard?" "Yes, sir." "To Washington." "Washington," Coleman mused. He looked from the passport to Leo, his gaze lingering on Leo's dark skin, his hoodie, and his worn backpack. The pieces in Coleman's mind did not add up. A black teen, alone, with a brand new passport, flying to DC. It was a puzzle Coleman's prejudice was all too eager to solve. "This thing's real?" Coleman asked. The question was casual, but his voice was loud enough for the people nearby to stop putting their laptops in bins and look over. "It's a valid US passport, sir," Leo said, his voice remaining level, though his heart was starting to drum a nervous rhythm against his ribs. This, Leo would later realize, was his mistake. The calm, factual answer was not taken as cooperation, it was taken as a challenge. Coleman's lips curled into a full-on smirk. He laughed. It wasn't a huff this time. It was a short, sharp, nasal ha of genuine, cruel amusement. "You sure about that?" Coleman said, his voice booming in the high-ceilinged hall. "This thing looks like it came off a printer in someone's basement. And Leonard Bishop, going to DC." He winked at his colleague, a younger woman named Janet Riley, who gave a weak, forced smile and quickly looked away. "Sir, my flight board's in 40 minutes, Leo said, the first edge of desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm traveling for a competition." "A competition!" Coleman roared, as if this were the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "Oh, I bet." "A competition in what?" "How to spend fake money." The humiliation was a physical weight. It was one thing to be questioned, it was another to be made into a floor show. Leo could feel dozens of eyes on him. He was no longer a person. He was a problem, a spectacle. "Sir, that's not appropriate," Leo said, his voice dropping. Coleman's face went from amused to concrete. The smile vanished. "What did you say to me?" "I said I need to get to my flight." "Oh, you don't get to decide what you need," Coleman spat. He slammed the passport shut. "You know what, Leonard? I think we need to have a little chat. Step out of line, over there." He pointed to the glass-walled secondary screening area, the dreaded detention box of the checkpoint. "On what grounds?" Leo asked, his mind racing. He knew his rights, mostly. "On the grounds that I'm a federal officer, and this document is questionable. And frankly," Coleman leaned in, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for the next 3 people to hear, "so are you. Now step aside before I have you removed." He didn't just point. He put his hand on Leo's shoulder and physically shoved him toward the seating area. "And your backpack," Coleman barked, grabbing it from Leo's shoulder. "And your phone. Put it in this bin. Now." Leo, outnumbered, outpowered, and burning with a cold, precise rage, did as he was told. He placed his phone in the grey plastic bin. Coleman snatched it, along with the passport, and tossed them onto his podium. "You wait here," Coleman ordered, gesturing to a hard plastic chair inside the glass enclosure. "Someone will be with you. Eventually." Coleman turned back to his line, a satisfied smirk on his face. He'd found his power for the day. He picked up the next passenger's ID. "Morning, ma'am. Where are we flying today?" Leo sat in the glass box, his hands clenched into fists, the sound of his own pulse roaring in his ears. He watched the digital clock on the wall. 10:17 a.m. His flight, gate B12, boarded at 10:45 a.m. The countdown had begun. The world outside the glass walls was muffled. The scrape of plastic bins, the monotonous drone of announcements, the anxious chatter of passengers. It all blended into a dull roar. Inside the box, the only clear sound was the buzzing of a fluorescent light overhead. Leo watched Frank Coleman work. The man was a performer. He was processing passengers, yes, but his true focus was on the box. Every few minutes, he would glance at Leo, his expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and boredom. He was drawing out the humiliation, letting it steep, He was the zookeeper, and Leo was the exhibit. Leo's mind, however, was not idle. It was processing, analyzing, and running threat assessments. Problem: detained by a hostile agent. Variable 1. Agent Coleman, motivated by prejudice and a clear power complex. Arguing is useless. It only feeds his ego. Variable 2. The flight, boarding in 28 minutes. Gate is a 5-minute walk. He had a 23-minute window before the doors closed. Variable 3. The competition. This was the critical part. His arrival in DC was not just for a trophy. He had a handler, a contact. He was supposed to check in upon landing. Failure to do so would trigger a protocol. He tried to catch the eye of the other officer, Janet Riley. She was younger than Coleman, with a nervous energy. She was clearly uncomfortable with Coleman's behavior, but she was also clearly terrified of him. She actively avoided looking toward the glass box, focusing intently on her own screen, her shoulders hunched. She was not an ally. She was a bystander, rendered inert by workplace dynamics. 10 minutes passed. 10:27 a.m. Leo's leg began to bounce, a small, betraying tremor of his rising panic. He stood up and knocked on the glass. Coleman ignored him. Leo knocked again, harder. Coleman let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough for his entire line to hear. "See this? This is what impatience gets you. A longer wait." He held up a hand to Leo. "Sit. Down." Leo sat. The cold rage was beginning to burn off, replaced by a freezing dread. This wasn't just about missing a flight. This was about failing a commitment. The people he was meeting in DC were not the kind of people you stood up. Finally, at 10:35 a.m., with only 10 minutes until boarding, Coleman sauntered over. He didn't open the door, just spoke through the glass. "All right, Leonard, I ran your little passport." He was holding it. "And, surprise, surprise, we're having some trouble." "What trouble?" Leo asked, his voice tight. "It's a valid government-issued document." "That's what you say," Coleman sneered. "But your story is thin. This cyber-thingy competition doesn't ring a bell. And we're showing no travel history for you. This passport is a ghost. You've never used it." "Of course I haven't used it," Leo said, his frustration making his voice sharp. "I told you, the last trip was cancelled. This is its first use." "Wrong answer," Coleman grinned. "Makes it more suspicious. People don't just get brand new passports to fly to DC for a competition. They use a driver's license, unless they don't have a valid ID." "I have a learner's permit," Leo shot back. "The passport is a primary federal ID. It's more secure." "Oh, we got a little lawyer now," Coleman laughed. He opened the door a crack. "You're getting smart with me, kid. I am Homeland Security, and you don't look smart. You look like a mule. What's in the bag?" He nodded to the bin with Leo's backpack, which was still sitting on the podium. "A laptop," Leo said. "Clothes, a notebook." "A laptop, huh? Bet it's all shiny and new. A payment, maybe? For services rendered?" Coleman was projecting. He was building a narrative that suited his worldview, a world where a young black man with a new passport must be a criminal. This was no longer just a power trip. This was an active, malicious attempt to build a case, to create a crime where none existed. Leo's mind went cold and clear. The flight was a secondary concern. His primary objective was now to exit this situation. "I am a minor," Leo said, his voice dropping to a near monotone. "You have detained me for over 20 minutes without cause. You have taken my property. I am requesting to speak to your supervisor. And I am requesting to make one phone call to my federal liaison." Leo had chosen the words carefully. Minor. Illegally detained. And the trump card, federal liaison. It didn't work. Coleman just laughed again, That same horrible nasal "ha." A federal liaison. Oh, that's rich. That's a new one. Who's your liaison, Leonard? The president? The king of Wakanda? The racist jibe hung in the air, thick and toxic. Officer Riley, who was close enough to hear, visibly flinched and moved further away. "You're not calling anyone," Coleman said, his face hardening again. The fun was over. "You're going to sit here until a real customs officer can come down and take a look at you. And they're busy. You're going to be here a while. You're definitely missing that flight." He slammed the glass door shut. The finality of it hit Leo like a punch. Coleman turned his back to the box, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He went back to his line. Leo looked at the clock. 10:41 a.m. Boarding was happening now. The gate would close in 4 minutes. He was done. He had failed. He slumped in the chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked at his phone, lying in the grey bin on Coleman's podium. It was so close, just 10 feet away. It was his only lifeline. And then, a small miracle. A supervisor, a different one, a woman with a stressed expression and a clipboard, stormed up to Coleman's lane. "Coleman, Lane 4's baggage scanner is down. I need you to move. Now. Go cover it." Coleman's face soured. "I'm busy with a 201, he said, jerking a thumb at Leo. "Possible fraudulent doc. And I've got a line backing up into the food court," the supervisor snapped. "Riley can watch the kid. Move. That's an order." Coleman, clearly furious at having his authority usurped, grumbled. He slammed his stamper down. "Fine." He glared at Leo. "Don't move." He stormed off toward the baggage screening area. He left the bin with Leo's backpack, his passport, and his phone. It was still sitting on the podium, which was now technically part of Officer Janet Riley's station. Leo stood up. Riley was pointedly looking at her screen, pretending the bin wasn't there, pretending Leo wasn't there. Her hands were shaking. Leo walked to the glass and pressed his face near the small slit at the bottom, used for passing documents. "Officer Riley," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. She didn't move. "Officer Riley, my name is Leo Bishop. I am 17 years old. I am a minor. Your partner, Officer Coleman, is illegally detaining me based on racial profiling. He has denied me my right to a phone call." Riley closed her eyes for a second, as if in pain. "Please, Mum," Leo begged, all pretense of analytics gone. "I am not a criminal. I am a consultant for the U.S. government. I need to contact my handler. My flight is gone, I know that. But this is now a security issue. Please, just my phone, one text." He added the magic words. "What he is doing is a crime, and right now, by watching, you are complicit." Riley's head snapped up. Her eyes, wide with panic, met his. She looked over at Coleman, who was now 30 feet away, angrily directing people to take off their shoes. She looked back at Leo. Her hand shot out. She grabbed the phone from the bin, her movements bird-like and terrified. She slid it through the document slot. 30 seconds, she whispered, her voice trembling. "Then it goes back in the bin. I never did this." "Thank you," Leo breathed. His thumbs were a blur. He didn't need to dial. He had one contact on speed dial, marked only KM. He sent a preset, coded text he had memorized for emergencies. "CLT, checkpoint B, code 9, Coleman." Code 9 was their duress signal. It meant compromised by a hostile third party. Adding Coleman's name was just for good measure. He hit send. The message delivered instantly. He pressed the power button, blanking the screen, and slid it back through the slot. Riley snatched it and dropped it back into the bin, her face pale as drywall. She immediately turned back to her terminal and started processing the next passenger, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the ID. Leo sat back down. The panic was gone. The rage was gone. He was cold, calm, and focused. He had pulled the pin on a grenade. He just had to wait for it to land. He didn't have to wait long. 5 minutes passed. It was 10:50 a.m. His flight was gone. Coleman was still at the baggage scanner. Then the atmosphere of the checkpoint changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a shift in pressure. The casual, shuffling energy of the passengers dissipated, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. 2 figures, a man and a woman, both dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits that screamed federal far louder than any uniform, were walking against the flow of traffic. They didn't stop at the start of the line. They walked straight up to the podium, flashing badges at a stunned-looking TSA supervisor. The woman was in her late 30s, with sharp features and a gaze that could cut glass. The man was broad, silent, and looked like he'd never smiled in his life. Coleman, seeing the commotion and the high-level badges, saw an opportunity. He left his post at the baggage scanner and bustled over, putting on his important officer face. "Agents, good morning," Coleman said, trying to insert himself. "Officer Frank Coleman. Is there a problem? We have the area secure." He gestured vaguely toward Leo. "In fact, I have a situation I was just about to escalate. This individual here." The woman in the suit cut him off. Her voice was flat, cold, and amplified by the terminal's acoustics. "We know all about your situation, Officer Coleman." She looked past him, her eyes finding Leo in the glass box. She gave a single, curt nod. Then she looked back at Coleman. "I'm Agent Kate Morrison, FBI. This is Agent Carter." Her eyes were steel. "And we're not here for him." She fixed her gaze on Coleman, a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "We're here for you." The name Agent Kate Morrison landed in the middle of the checkpoint like a flash bang. All sound seemed to stop, sucked into the vacuum of her authority. The TSA supervisor, who had been trying to manage the line, froze with her mouth open. Officer Riley looked like she was going to be physically ill, her face a sickly, greenish white. Frank Coleman, however, was a man whose ego was a fortress. He was, for a critical moment, incapable of processing that he was the target. His brain defaulted to the only narrative it could accept. The kid in the box was a major criminal, and these high-level feds were here to take him. This was, in his mind, the ultimate vindication. "Well, thank God you're here, Agent," Coleman said, puffing out his chest. He was practically vibrating with self-importance. "I knew it. I knew this kid was trouble from the second I saw him. The passports are fake, I'm sure of it. He was giving me some wild story about a federal liaison." "I am his federal liaison," Morrison snapped. The words cut Coleman off at the knees. He blinked. "You... what?" "Agent Kate Morrison, FBI Cyber Division," she repeated, speaking slowly, as if to a child. "Mr. Bishop is our guest. He is traveling to Washington at the direct invitation of the FBI director for the Cyber Guard finals." She walked past the dumbstruck Coleman, past Officer Riley, and directly to the door of the glass box. She didn't have a key. She didn't need one. She just stared at Riley. "Open it." Riley, shaking, fumbled with her keycard and swiped the lock. The door clicked open. Leo stood up and walked out. He adjusted his hoodie and picked up his backpack from the bin. He slid his phone into his pocket and grabbed his passport, which was still on Coleman's podium. He stood next to Agent Morrison, looking small but untouchable, like a bishop protected by a queen. Coleman's face was a chaotic slideshow of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and the dawning, horrific realization that he had made a catastrophic error. "Now, wait a minute," Coleman stammered, holding up his hands. "You're saying, him? He's with you?" "He is," Morrison said. "But I was just following procedure." Coleman's voice was rising, cracking with panic. "His document was suspicious. He was disrespectful. He couldn't verify his story. I did everything by the book." Agent Carter, who hadn't spoken yet, finally did. His voice was a low gravel. "By the book? Is that what you call it?" Carter pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket. "Your procedure, Officer Coleman, included mocking a passenger's appearance, mocking his name, and making a racially motivated comment about the King of Wakanda. We have 3 passengers from your line who have already filed complaints in the last 10 minutes, and we have the audio from your own checkpoint recorders." Coleman's blood drained from his face. That's taken out of context. I was building rapport, trying to de-escalate." "De-escalate?" Morrison's voice dripped with scorn. "You illegally detained a minor. You denied him his right to a phone call. You subjected him to public humiliation. And in doing so, you interfered with a federal asset." "Federal asset?" Coleman shrieked. "He's a kid. Look at him. He's wearing a cartoon hoodie." "That kid, as you call him," Morrison said, her voice dropping dangerously low, "is one of the most gifted white-hat hackers this country has ever produced. He has, in the last 6 months, identified and helped us patch 3 critical vulnerabilities in the national power grid. The competition you mocked him about? He's the keynote speaker. After he wins it." The silence that followed was absolute. Leo just watched Coleman, his expression unreadable. Coleman was breathing hard, his face slick with sweat. He was cornered, and he knew it. He did what all cornered animals do. He lashed out, looking for someone else to blame. He pointed a shaking finger at his colleague. Riley, she saw it. She knew he was suspicious too. She didn't say anything. Officer Riley, who had been trying to melt into the X-ray machine, let out a small, terrified squeak. Morrison didn't even look at Riley. Her focus was locked on Coleman. "Oh, we're well aware of what Officer Riley did and didn't do, Frank." Coleman's last bit of bluster kicked in. You can't do this. This is harassment. I'm just doing my job. You're FBI. You don't have jurisdiction over TSA procedure. I'm filing a complaint with my union. I'm filing a complaint with your supervisor." "You can certainly try," Morrison said calmly, "but you're going to be busy." She looked at her partner. "Agent Carter." Carter stepped forward. He reached inside his jacket. It wasn't a recorder he pulled out this time. It was a pair of standard-issue, gleaming steel handcuffs. Coleman's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. What is... No!" "Frank Coleman," Agent Carter said, his voice flat and formal. "You are under arrest." Coleman physically recoiled, stumbling back against the X-ray machine's conveyor belt. "For what? For what? For hassling a kid? That's not an arrestable offense. I'll sue you all." He was hysterical, his voice echoing through the concourse. Every passenger, every airport employee, every barista at the nearby Starbucks was watching. This was the show now. Frank Coleman, the man who loved an audience, had finally gotten one. "We're not arresting you for being a racist, Coleman," Agent Morrison said, though her tone implied she wished she could. "That's just a bonus for the Office of Professional Responsibility." She stepped closer, and her voice was for him alone. "No, Frank, we're arresting you for conspiracy to commit human trafficking." The words, human trafficking, detonated in the small space. Leo's head snapped up. He had assumed this was all about him, about the profiling. He had thought he was the one who called in the cavalry, but Morrison's words recontextualized everything. This wasn't a rescue. This was a takedown. He had just been the catalyst. Coleman's reaction was the most telling. His hysterical blustering, the threats of lawsuits, the self-righteous anger, it all evaporated. He didn't say, "That's ridiculous," or "You're insane." He just deflated. The color drained from his face, leaving a waxy, yellow-pale sheen. His entire body went slack. He stammered. "I don't know what you're talking about." It was the weakest, most transparent denial Leo had ever heard. "You don't?" Morrison's voice was laced with a chilling, predatory calm. "Let me refresh your memory. We've been watching you for 6 months, Frank. Ever since an analyst in our trafficking division. An analyst, by the way, who is half your age and twice as smart, flagged a statistical impossibility at this very checkpoint." She began to pace, just 2 steps back and forth, like a panther in a cage. "See, this checkpoint, lane 3 specifically, had a 0% rate of random secondary selection for certain passengers. Passengers who, despite fitting numerous risk profiles, skated right through. But on the same days, your random selection rate for other passengers, families, the elderly, or, in this case, young black men, was over 300% above the airport average." Coleman was shaking his head, mute. "You were the screener, Frank," Morrison continued. "You were the one waving them through. We just couldn't figure out how. What was your signal? How did you coordinate?" Agent Carter stepped in, his voice filling the void. "Turns out, your signal was your partner. You weren't just a cog, Coleman. You were the ringleader for this hub. You'd get a text with a passenger's description, you'd spot them in line, and then you'd create a distraction." Carter gestured to Leo. "Like this. You'd pick the most obvious, easiest target for your little power trip. Someone you could profile, someone you thought wouldn't fight back. You'd make a scene, like you did with Mr. Bishop. You'd yell, you'd laugh, you'd detain them. You'd draw every eye in the checkpoint to your little drama. And while you were busy playing tin pot dictator," Morrison finished the thought, pointing to the next lane, "your partner, Officer Riley, would wave the real target through. No scans, no questions. A young woman who didn't speak English. A terrified teenager with no luggage. While everyone was watching you humiliate a 17-year-old boy, you were letting a slave trader walk right past." The horror of it settled on Leo. His humiliation, his anger. It had all been a tool, a smokescreen for a crime so monstrous he could barely comprehend it. Coleman finally found his voice, a desperate, squealing sound. "No, that's not. It was Riley. It was all her. She blackmailed me. She's the one. Ask her." He pointed again at Officer Janet Riley, who was now weeping openly, her body pressed against the wall, as if she could phase through it. "Agent Morrison," Riley sobbed, her voice muffled. He made me. He said he'd hurt my family. He said he knew where my kids went to school." Morrison and Carter shared a look. It was not a look of sympathy. "Save it," Carter grunted. "We've had a lip reader on you for 2 weeks. We have footage of you taking a cash-filled envelope in the employee parking garage 3 days ago. You weren't blackmailed. You were a partner." Morrison turned her attention to Riley, her expression one of profound disgust. "And you know what's pathetic, Janet? You almost had us. We saw you on the camera. You saw us arrive at the checkpoint. And then, in a desperate, last-second attempt to save your own skin, you passed Mr. Bishop his phone. You tried to look like the good guy, the one who helped." She leaned in. "You didn't help him. You were trying to create a witness for your defense. It was the most cowardly, self-serving thing I've ever seen. And it was about 30 minutes too late." Morrison nodded at Carter. Carter moved. He grabbed Coleman's right arm and spun him around, slamming him against the side of the podium with a force that knocked the wind out of him. "You have the right to remain silent." Coleman let out a strangled cry as the handcuffs ratcheted shut. "You're wrong. You're wrong. I want a lawyer." "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," Carter continued, his voice a monotone as he pulled Coleman upright. Morrison, meanwhile, had produced a second pair of handcuffs. She walked over to the sobbing Janet Riley. Riley didn't resist. She just slid down the wall, holding her hands out as Morrison cuffed her. "You have the right to an attorney," Morrison said quietly, her voice devoid of all emotion. "If you cannot afford one will be appointed to you." The entire checkpoint was a graveyard. The TSA supervisor, who had been on her radio, was now directing a flood of airport police to the scene to create a perimeter and get the other lines moving. 2 uniformed airport police officers took custody of the cuffed TSA agents. "Get them out of here," Carter ordered. "Separate cars. Transport them to the federal building. We'll meet you there." Frank Coleman, his face a mask of sweat, tears, and abject terror, was hauled to his feet. As they dragged him past, his eyes met Leo's. There was no anger left in them, no superiority, no amusement. There was only a hollow, bottomless, begging emptiness. He, Frank Coleman, the man who held all the power, was now utterly powerless. He was being led away in chains, his life over, while the nerdy black kid he'd laughed at just stood there, free, watching him go. Leo didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel joy. He just felt a profound, chilling emptiness. Coleman was led away, his repeated screams of, "I want a lawyer," echoing down the concourse until he was out of sight. The checkpoint was quiet. Agent Morrison turned to Leo, the hard, steel-trap expression on her face finally softening into something resembling human concern. "Leo," she said, letting out a long breath. "You okay? That was not how this was supposed to go." "I'm fine, Agent Morrison," Leo said, his voice a little hoarse. I thought he was just a racist." "He is," Morrison said, her eyes dark. "But the worst kinds of evil always nest inside the petty ones. Racism, greed. They're just different heads on the same snake." She looked at him, a new, sharp curiosity in her eyes. "Speaking of which, your text. Code 9. Coleman. You sent that before we arrived. How did you know his name was connected to anything? We were here to arrest him, yes, but you weren't supposed to be part of this. How did you know he was the target?" Leo hesitated, glancing at the busy checkpoint. The TSA supervisor was already trying to get passengers moving again, her voice strained as she called for new officers. "Let's walk," Morrison said, gesturing for Leo and Carter to follow. She led them away from the chaos toward the relative quiet of the B concourse. "Talk to me, Leo." Leo took a deep breath, his brain finally catching up with the events. "It was a guess, an educated one." "Educated how?" Carter asked, his eyes still scanning the crowd, ever the protector. "When I got to the airport," Leo began, "I had about an hour to kill. So, I was bored." Morrison's lips twitched. "Bored is usually when my paperwork triples. What did you do, Leo?" "I connected to the airport's public Wi-Fi," Leo said, almost sheepishly. It's a sieve. It's barely secure. I wasn't trying to break anything. I was just looking around, seeing the architecture." "Looking around," Morrison translated, "means you were mapping their entire network 5 minutes after you logged on." "It's a badly configured network," Leo said defensively. "The public-facing portal has a vulnerability that allows a user to see the device list on the secure staff network. I couldn't help but notice, and I saw something weird, Carter and Morrison were now fully focused on him. There were a few devices on the staff network, TSA-issued hardware, that were making repeated encrypted pings to an unsecured server, Leo said. A server in Eastern Europe. Morrison stopped walking. A server you recognized? A server I recognized from the other project, Leo said, using their code for the last major case he'd helped them with. It's a known dead drop server for a trafficking ring we were tracking. I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe a different group using the same hardware. I made a note of the device's MAC addresses. I was going to send them to you when I landed in DC. He paused, and then I got to the checkpoint, and Officer Coleman decided to have his fun. When he detained me, I was angry, but I was also looking. While he was yelling at me, I was reading his badge. F. Coleman. And I was reading his partner's, J. Riley. Go on, Carter prompted. I pulled out my phone just to check the time before he made me put it in the bin. But in the 30 seconds I had it, I ran a search on the staff manifest I'd borrowed from the network. Morrison sighed. Leo. The names F. Coleman and J. Riley were assigned to 2 of the 3 devices that were pinging the server. Morrison's eyes widened. You're telling me you identified the corrupt agents while you were standing in their line? I didn't know, Leo insisted. I just knew they were dirty. I didn't know what for. I just knew they were compromised. I thought they were stealing from bags or smuggling. I don't know, drugs. Not that. So when Coleman detained you, Morrison picked up the thread. You thought it was because he'd somehow made you as a threat? No, Leo said, shaking his head. That's the part that's weird. He detained me because he's a bigot. He had no idea I knew anything. He just decided to harass me for his own amusement. His prejudice and his criminal life were 2 separate things. He was just a corrupt, racist idiot. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Leo, she said, her voice filled with a strange new respect. We've been on this for 6 months. 6 months. We had an undercover agent in place. We had surveillance. We suspected they were using the checkpoint to create distractions, but we didn't have the digital link. We couldn't prove Coleman and Riley were the ones controlling the operation from the inside. We had them on suspicion. Our UC was supposed to make the final buy-in today to get the direct evidence. She looked at him. You, in 20 minutes, sitting at Gate B4 with a laptop and a grudge against bad network security. You found the smoking gun. You tied them directly to the server. You just confirmed our entire case. Your text. Code 9. Coleman. You weren't telling us you were in trouble. You were telling us you found him. Leo shrugged. A little of both, I guess. Agent Carter let out a low whistle. Kid, when you get to DC, I'm buying you a steak. Morrison's phone buzzed. She looked at it, and a grim smile spread across her face. That was our undercover. He was in lane 4, just like we thought. Coleman was so focused on you, so wrapped up in his little power trip. He missed every signal our agent was giving him. He completely ignored our UC, his obsession with you. She looked at Leo. His easy target almost blew his own operation. He got so lost in the petty racist drama that he forgot to commit his actual, primary-level felony. So what does that mean? Leo asked. It means, Morrison said, that when our UC realized Coleman was occupied, he signaled us to move in. Your text just confirmed we had the right man. You were the distraction, Leo, just not the one Coleman intended. You were our distraction. You kept him busy while we put the net around him. She put her phone away and clapped a hand on Leo's shoulder. Come on, you've missed your flight. But I'm a federal agent. I think I can get you on the next one. She smiled. In first class. They walked toward the American Airlines service desk, a strange trio, 2 grim-faced FBI agents and a 17-year-old in a hoodie. The atmosphere around them was electric. Passengers whispered and pointed, cell phones discreetly raised. "So," Leo said, processing the new reality. "The FBI was already here. You were at the airport today, specifically to arrest him." "That's right," Carter confirmed. "We were in the observation room, just above the checkpoint, watching the whole thing on camera. We were waiting for him to wave our undercover agent through. That was the signal to move." "Then, why did you wait?" Leo asked, a sudden cold anger replacing his shock. "You were watching? You watched him do that to me? For how long?" Morrison's face tightened. She stopped and turned to him. "That," she said, her voice full of regret, "is the part I'm going to have to live with. We saw him pull you aside. We saw the initial confrontation. In our business, Leo, we have to make impossible choices. If we moved in to stop him from being a monster to you, we would have blown the entire operation. Coleman would have clammed up, the ring would have scattered, and the people they were moving, they would have been lost, disappeared." She looked him square in the eye. "We had to wait for the primary crime to be in motion. We had to let him start to wave our UC through. What he did to you was unconscionable. It was abuse of power. But what he was about to do was human trafficking. We had to prioritize. It was a hell of a choice." Leo's anger deflated. He understood. It was a trolley problem, and he was the person on the side track. "But he didn't wave your agent through. You said he was too busy with me." "He didn't," Morrison said. "But then your text came through. Code 9, Coleman. And 5 seconds later, I got a different text. From you." "I only sent one," Leo said, confused. "No," Morrison said, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. "You sent 2. The first was your Code 9 text. The second one, well, your thumb must have hit it by accident when you were sliding it back to Riley." She held up her phone. There, under Leo's first text, was a second. It wasn't a text at all. It was a file, a tiny 12K-based file. "You sent me the raw data logs from the airport network," Morrison said, showing Coleman's and Riley's devices, pinging the server in real time. "You sent us the direct evidence. The moment we got that, we no longer needed the undercover agent. We had him. We had the whole ring." Leo stared at the phone. He had no memory of sending the file. It must have been a misclick in his haste. A ghost in the machine. A bit of digital karma. "The moment that file landed," Carter said, "Morrison gave the order. We moved. Your Code 9 was the alert. But that file was the go-ahead. You didn't just stumble into our operation, kid. You finished it." Leo let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. He wasn't just a victim. He wasn't just a distraction. He was the one who, in the end, had sprung the trap. At the service desk, the gate agent looked up, saw Agent Morrison's badge, and her entire demeanor changed. How can I help you, Agent?" "I need to get Mr. Bishop on the next flight to Washington Reagan. First class." "Of course. One moment." The agent's fingers flew across the keyboard. "There is a flight departing in 45 minutes from gate C10. I've put him in seat 2A. She handed over the new boarding pass. "Thank you," Morrison said. She turned to Leo. "Agent Carter will escort you to the gate. I have to stay here and clean this up." She gestured back toward the checkpoint, which was now a hive of FBI agents in windbreakers and airport officials. "Wait," Leo said. "What about Coleman and Riley? What happens to them?" Morrison's expression went cold again. "They're being transported to the federal courthouse. They'll be arraigned by 4 p.m. We've got them on camera. We've got them on audio. We've got passenger testimony. And thanks to you, we have the digital forensics to tie them directly to an international trafficking ring. They are, to use a technical term, done." She looked at him. "This isn't just about them losing their jobs, Leo. They are facing multiple federal charges: conspiracy, trafficking, deprivation of rights under color of law. They're going to prison for a very, very long time. Frank Coleman laughed at your passport today. He will not be laughing tomorrow." Carter put a hand on Leo's shoulder. "Come on, kid. Let's get you to your flight. You've got a competition to win." Leo sat in seat 2A, the leather plush and ridiculously wide. A flight attendant had already taken his hoodie and offered him a pre-departure orange juice. It was a different world from the one he'd inhabited an hour ago. He was the same person, in the same clothes, but the context had changed. The system now saw him as important. He looked out the window as the plane pushed back from the gate. He watched the sprawling terminal of Charlotte Douglas grow smaller. Down there, somewhere in the bowels of the building, Frank Coleman's life was being dismantled, piece by piece. The flight was short. When he landed at Reagan, Agent Morrison was waiting for him at the gate. Not a hologram, not a video call. The real Agent Morrison. "You fly fast," Leo noted. "FBI has its own plane," she said with a shrug. "How was first class?" "Too much legroom," Leo said, and she almost smiled. "Come with me," she said. "We're not going straight to the hotel. There's someone who wants to meet you." They walked not toward baggage claim, but toward a restricted, official use elevator. They went up, through a series of badged doors, and into a sterile, quiet conference room. A man in a sharp suit stood to greet them. He was older, with graying hair and a powerful, weary face. "Leo Bishop," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Vance, Assistant Director for the region. Note, fictional name. I wanted to apologize." Leo shook his hand. It was firm and dry. "What happened to you today was a disgrace," Vance said, his voice low and serious. "It was a failure at every level. A failure of our security, a failure of our oversight, and a failure of our trust." Agent Morrison explained the operation, Leo said. "She did," Vance nodded. "And the operational necessity doesn't excuse the outcome. Frank Coleman and Janet Riley, they were monsters hiding in plain sight. They used the color of their authority as a shield for their crimes, and they used their prejudice as a weapon." Vance sat down. "Here's the karma, Leo. The real karma. Coleman is in an interrogation room right now. He's singing. He's trying to flip on Riley, but she's already flipped on him. It's a race to the bottom. The entire ring, from here to Miami to Eastern Europe, is collapsing right now because of the server data you grabbed. We're making arrests as we speak." He leaned forward. "But that's the criminal karma. Then there's the systemic karma. Coleman, in his arrogance, in his decision to laugh at a 17-year-old kid, has brought a world of scrutiny down on that entire airport. He has single-handedly triggered a top-to-bottom review of TSA hiring and oversight for the entire Southeast." "He thought he was a king," Leo said quietly, laughing at a peasant. "He was," Vance agreed, "but he didn't realize the peasant had a direct line to the actual king, and he definitely didn't realize the peasant could read his mail." Vance smiled, a thin, tired smile. "The competition you're here for. We, the FBI, are co-sponsors, and there's been a change in the schedule. The director wants to introduce you himself. He wants you to talk to the other finalists, and to our new agent trainees about what you did today, about how you saw a weakness in a system, both a human one and a digital one, and exposed it. Leo just nodded, absorbing it. He had been targeted because of his face, his youth, his skin. He had been made to feel small, powerless, and criminal. And now? Frank Coleman, Vance said, will spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. He'll be known not as a cop or an officer, but as a human trafficker who got brought down by the 17-year-old kid he tried to bully. The plane had been a barrier, the checkpoint had been a wall, and Frank Coleman had been the gatekeeper. But Coleman, in his blind arrogance, had laughed at the one person who didn't need a gate. Leo was a systems expert. He didn't need to open locked doors, he just built his own. Looking at Agent Morrison and Assistant Director Vance, Leo realized his competition wasn't just about winning a trophy anymore. It was about building a better system, a system where men like Frank Coleman couldn't laugh and couldn't hide ever again. That, he thought, was the hardest, truest karma of all. That's the story of Frank Coleman, the TSA officer who picked the wrong passenger to bully. He thought he was asserting his dominance over a powerless teenager. What he didn't know was that he was laughing in the face of the one person who had the power to expose his entire criminal empire. Karma in this story wasn't a magical force. It was precise. It was a 17-year-old's mind, a few lines of code, and the arrogance of a man who believed his prejudice was protected by his badge. In the end, his laugh wasn't just cruel, it was the sound of his own downfall. The very system he abused to commit his crimes was the system that a brilliant young man used to bring him to justice. What did you think of Frank's downfall? What would you have done in Leo's situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to see that karma is real. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story of justice being served.